Good afternoon, colleagues. We're going to move to First Minister's questions shortly, but can I ask the First Minister if she wishes to give us a short statement first, before we do?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I will just give a very short update on the daily statistics. The total number of positive cases reported yesterday was 465, which is 7.9% of people newly tested. The total number of cases, therefore, now is 25,960. There will be the usual regional breakdown available later, but I can say now that 219 of the cases are in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, 73 in Lothian and 66 in Lanarkshire. The number for Greater Glasgow and Clyde in quite large part reflects a significant cluster related to student accommodation at Glasgow University, and I'm sure we'll come on to discuss some of these issues shortly. And the remaining 107 cases are spread across 9 other health board areas. 84 people are in hospital, which is an increase of 1 from yesterday. 10 people are in intensive care, which is the same as yesterday, though I should insert a caveat there due to some technical issues. NHS Lothian's figures for intensive care haven't yet been taken account of, so their figures from yesterday are in that figure, and when we know their more up-to-date figure, it may change the overall number. And I regret to have to report that in the past 24 hours, 2 deaths have been registered of patients who first tested positive over the previous 28 days. And the total number of deaths under this measurement is now 2,510. And again, my condolences go to everyone who has lost a loved one, including, of course, everyone whose loss has occurred in the last few days. I can also report that we will shortly publish our latest estimate for the R number, which we do every Thursday. This estimate confirms our view that the R number is currently above 1 and possibly now as high as 1.6. I think all of these figures demonstrate again why we announced tough measures on Tuesday to reduce transmission and to get the virus back under control. And I would urge finally everybody to stick to those new rules. With some limited exceptions, none of us should be visiting each other's homes at the moment, outdoors or in public indoor spaces. We mustn't meet in groups of any more than 6 from a maximum of 2 households. Children under 12 are not included in these limits. Outdoors and young people aged 12 to 17 are exempt from the 2 household limit. They can meet outdoors in groups of up to 6, but should still physically distance from one another. We've also announced new restrictions on hospitality. From tomorrow, all such premises will close by 10 p.m. And beyond that, we are asking people to limit visits to and social interactions in pubs and restaurants as much as possible. These measures are tough. I think we all know that, but they are necessary if we are to keep schools open, resume more non-COVID NHS services, keep care homes safe and protect jobs. And if we don't act now, the danger is the virus will continue to spread and even more severe or longer lasting restrictions will be required later. But if we can start to reduce the number of new cases over the next few weeks, we will be better placed for the winter ahead. So I'm asking everybody to follow the new rules and also to make sure that you download Protect Scotland, the Protect.Scot app. And finally, for everybody to remember facts. Face coverings, avoid crowded places, clean hands and hard surfaces, 2 metres distance and self-isolate and book a test if you have symptoms. Thank you for the opportunity to give that update, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, First Minister. We're going to turn to questions shortly. I'll just remind members that we're going to continue with the approach of taking all the supplementaries at the end of the last question, which is question 7. So all supplementaries then, but members can press their request to speak buttons as soon as possible to let me know they wish to ask a supplementary. Question number 1, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you. Presiding Officer, this week we've seen major COVID outbreaks within many of Scotland's universities. So far, we're aware of significant spikes in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee and Aberdeen, with more than 1,000 students being told to self-isolate. Realistically, we must expect that figure to rise, and probably significantly, in the days ahead. Yesterday, the First Minister said that discussions were continuing about what may be required as the situation evolves. So can I ask what extra measures are being considered?
First Minister.
There have been discussions ongoing with the university sector. The Minister Richard Lockhead convened discussions with university principals yesterday, and discussions were ongoing last night, and we will set out some further measures, I hope, later today. These will be measures about prevention, about making sure that all of the guidance is being properly and rigorously implemented on campus and in student accommodation, that students understand their obligations, but also that universities are properly supporting students. Can I just say briefly, the situation at universities is difficult, not least for those students who are being asked to isolate, and there is obviously a welfare issue there that I know universities are very alive to and take very seriously. We will no doubt discuss more about preventative action later on. One thing I want to stress, though, and it can be a difficult issue, I guess, for people to grasp, but the fact that we do have a number of positive cases identified, and I would agree that we would expect that to increase, and a number of students being asked to isolate, is test and protect working. Now, I think there is more we can do to prevent cases, but nevertheless, the essence of test and protect is making sure that where people have symptoms, they are tested, students are being tested, that they are identified if they're positive, and then advice is given to their contacts to isolate. So that's a difficult thing when numbers are as they are, but it does show that that system is working, and we must continue to have confidence in that. And of course, we must, difficult though this is, and it is really difficult for students, ask them to follow all of the advice. Don't socialise outside your own households, and for universities to make sure that all of the guidance on campus and in student accommodation is being followed.
Ruth Davis.
Thank you. Calls have previously been made, notably about Willie Rennie, for all international students to be tested. But the circumstances now being faced at many of our universities clearly suggest that action beyond that is needed to halt the spread of the virus within these institutions and into the wider community. Now, we know that the Scottish Government's plans for walk-in testing centres included university sites, but we also know that only 2 of the planned 22 centres have opened, and that number will rise to half by the end of October. The figures we're seeing in the last few days show that we can't wait over a month to get these centres up and running. We need them now. So will the First Minister tell us what action she is taking to accelerate the programme?
First Minister.
That programme is underway, and it's an important part of our testing capacity. It's not the only part, which I'll come on to in a moment. As members know, St Andrews is already open. The centre in the centre of Glasgow is already open. I can tell the Chamber that bookings open today for the new walk-in centre in Aberdeen, and bookings open tomorrow for a centre in Edinburgh. New sites are being identified currently for Dundee. There will be a second Glasgow centre, opens on the 2nd of October, and one in Stirling on Monday the 5th of October. Others will follow after that. But it's important to say there is also mobile testing capacity. There's been a mobile testing unit at Abertay University in the last day or so. There is one at the Marano Student Village at Glasgow University, where a lot of the positive cases are as of now. And an important point to make, and there is never any complacency from me in saying these things, but there is no issue at the moment of students who are symptomatic getting tested and getting tested quickly and getting those results. For example, yesterday, I think at the Glasgow Walkthrough Centre, they tested almost 300 students and still had some capacity left at the end of the day. So we continue to make sure that the right things are done, but I want to give an assurance that testing capacity is available and is being accessed and utilised. On the issue of asymptomatic testing, we continue, not just in universities, but more generally to consider these things on clinical advice. But it's very, very important to stress that where somebody who doesn't have symptoms gets tested one day and tests negative, if they have, particularly if they've been in contact with positive or potentially positive cases, that does not take away the need to self-isolate, because they could be in the incubation period and test positive a day or so later. So the most important thing here is testing people with symptoms, contacting, identifying and giving the right advice to their contacts. And I am confident that's been done, although we continue to monitor it with universities very carefully.
Ruth Davidson.
I agree with the First Minister on the importance of the contact tracing. And in the spring, the First Minister stated the government's intention to recruit 2,000 contact tracers by the end of May. And at the time she said, it's really important we have the capacity in place and the ability to increase that capacity in future should we need it. But this week we learned that less than half, only 874 of those tracers are actually in place across the country. So does the First Minister agree that given the situation we see in our universities today, those tracers are needed now more than ever? And can she tell the Chamber when they'll now be delivered?
First Minister.
So I addressed this issue at some length when I did the daily update yesterday, and I appreciate people are seeing information and drawing conclusions from it, but it is not true to say that we don't have what we said earlier in the summer is that health boards were going to create a pool of 2,000 contact tracers. They were doing that from within their own resources that was available for to be called on should demand require it. That pool is there. What we are doing also, though, is permanently recruiting to replace that pool over time so that it is a more permanent pool of contact tracers. But health boards have the capacity they need right now. In some health boards that have outbreaks, that comes under strain. That's why we also have the National Contact Tracing Centre. So health boards who are facing outbreaks and who need additional support can pass some of the caseload they've got onto the National Centre for additional support. So it is not the case that the capacity that is needed is not there. It is there. We are simply going through a process of redeploying and replacing one capacity with another. And health boards have in place not just the capacity they need for demand right now, but they have all been asked to put in place and have in place the ability, if necessary, to double their capacity in the space of 24 hours. So I want again to give people an assurance that people who are working in these roles are working really hard and under pressure. But we have testing capacity that is standing up to the demand right now. We have contact tracing capacity that is standing up to the demand. The performance of our contact tracers in terms of the percentage of index cases and contacts that they are identifying, I think is way above other parts of the UK. So the system is working. It is going to come under increasing pressure, which is why we are working hard to make sure we build the resilience into that is required.
Thank you. How we react to this spike is going to influence how big the spike becomes. And none of us wants to see restrictions placed on students because this is such an important time for young people, and the new people that you meet and the experiences that you have as students can shape your entire lives. But it's clear from the figures emerging this week that an increase in infection rates is being driven from within the student population. In Glasgow, around half of all cases that have been identified within the university. And there's a clear concern that it could spread, particularly given the number of students that travel into uni from neighbouring areas and then return home. The First Minister has previously accepted the need for routine testing across care homes. Will she now examine the case for such routine testing across Scotland's university campuses?
First Minister.
We will always examine the case for that, but we also have to, and I've said this in relation to care homes, people will have heard me say it many times, and what I'm about to say is informed by the clinical advice that the government takes. Routine testing, particularly in highly vulnerable situations like care homes, has a part to play. It may have a part to play in other settings, but we've got to be very careful that we do not allow routine testing to be seen as some kind of pass out of all of the other obligations, because, as I say, when people who don't have symptoms are being tested, there is a real risk of false assurance coming from negative tests. So testing does not remove the fundamental importance of following all of the right advice, of self-isolating when you're asked to do that, of making sure that you're not interacting with people you shouldn't be interacting, and following all of the facts advice when you do. I know how, or I can imagine, my university days are a long time ago, but I can imagine just how awful this is for students right now. My own nephew has just started at university in Edinburgh and is living in halls of residence, so I think we all know from relatives, we don't want our young people to be living with this, but it is really important that students recognise the risk to themselves and the risk to others and follow all the guidance. Don't have house parties, don't socialise out with your own household group, and make sure you have Protect Scotland downloaded onto your phone, and make sure you are following all of the facts advice, and that is my appeal to every student across the country.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Multiple COVID clusters across universities in Scotland, hundreds of students self-isolating, students are waiting for tests, and frontline university staff at risk of catching and spreading COVID-19. First Minister, is this what you expected to happen when you gave the go-ahead to students returning to universities this academic year?
First Minister.
Look, these These decisions are not easy for any of us, so let's reverse that and say we had decided to keep all students away from university. Just as in the days when we thought we may not be able to get children back to school full-time, Richard Leonard and others were saying actually we should be trying to normalise education. And I suspect if we had been in the position where we said no students are to be at university, Richard Leonard perfectly legitimately might have been standing up here today saying what we're going to do to get education back to young people. So we've got to find the right safe balance to have as much education for our young people while keeping them safe and minimising the risk. So that's why the guidance is in place around blended learning on campus, around all of the things that universities and colleges have to do. The really difficult guidance that exists in student accommodation about not mixing between households, not having parties, all of that, that is really tough stuff for everybody. And you know, like dealing with this virus, in all sorts of aspects of our life, we can't magic it away, and decisions we take to minimise the risk of it in one way raise risks elsewhere. There are no harm-free options available for any of us right now, and that's why we all have to accept the responsibility of playing our part. And unfortunately, students are part of that. So we need to make sure people know what to do, abide by these rules. We give students the support they need. We do have access to testing, and students do have access to testing. And it is absolutely right that questions are asked of me of all of these issues around testing. I appeal to people across the chamber, though, not to inadvertently, and I stress inadvertently, I know nobody is trying to do this, but not undermine confidence in the Test and Protect system, because it's really important that we say to people, if you need tested, get tested, the capacity is there, and it's really important for the greater good that you take up that opportunity.
Richard Leonard.
Thank you. But First Minister, this was predicted in the same way that the spike in demand for testing was predicted before the schools returned. You keep saying that Test and Protect is working well. But this morning on the BBC, the Director of Universities Scotland, Alistair Sim, said that despite discussions with both governments, neither were able to provide sufficient testing capacity. He said, and I quote him, there was not enough kit available at the very beginning of term to enable that for everybody. This is basic. This failure to test is a failure to contain the virus. This will cost people their health, their hopes, and some even their lives. This is the same failure we've had from day one of the pandemic, a failure to anticipate, a failure to plan, and above all, a failure to test. First Minister, why were you not better prepared?
First Minister.
Look, I accept criticism and scrutiny. I actually welcome it, but I do think at the heart of Richard Leonard's question if there is a failure, it is a failure to understand some of the basics of what we are seeking to do here, and some of the basics of how testing work. I didn't hear Alistair Sim on the radio this morning, but I've had an account of what he said. I think he was referring to availability of home testing kits. Now, there is an issue with the availability of home testing kits. They come through the UK-wide system. It's an issue we've been taking up with the UK government, trying to resolve it with them. But what there isn't, and again, I'll insert a caveat here that's always important, because it doesn't mean that no individual on any given day is not having some difficulty getting a test when they want it, where they want it. Of course, that will happen. But it is not the case, and it is really important the message from this chamber today isn't that it is the case that students who need to be tested right now are not getting tested. They are getting tested. That is why we have the numbers of positive cases. If we weren't testing students with coronavirus right now, these numbers that I'm reporting would be much smaller than they are, and the numbers being asked to isolate would be smaller than they are. There's something, I accept, counterintuitive in all of this, but in some way, of course, we want to prevent cases to keep these numbers low, but the higher the numbers are when you have an outbreak, the more people are obviously being tested and are being identified, and then Test and Protect does its work. So what I say to people is ask questions, scrutinise, criticise where that is legitimate, but the worst thing any of us could do right now was unfairly and unjustifiably undermine confidence in Test and Protect, because it is so important that people across the country, including students, have that confidence, and that confidence right now is justified.
Richard Leonard.
But students were told that they could return to universities and the communal living that goes with that safely. And we've all been told that Test and Protect is working well. but now students are suffering the consequences of failure. Students, some as young as 17 and away from home for the first time, are living without established support networks. We know that this in itself can have an impact on young people's mental health. On top of this, some of them are self-isolating in cramped accommodation, and many more will be anxious that they won't be allowed to go home for Christmas. Students and staff who work in their accommodation need to know that the government is working towards a solution. So what are you planning, First Minister, to avoid students either being confined in accommodation away from families over Christmas, or students returning home with the fear and very real risk that they are spreading COVID-19 to their friends and families back home?
If Richard Leonard, as I am sure he is really concerned about the welfare of students and not increasing the already anxious situation they're in, I'm going to say this to Richard Leonard. I think he'd have asked that question in a very different way, because, you know, talking right now about things like students not allowed to go home for Christmas, that is not helping anybody. We all have to work right now to make sure that we cope with this infectious virus, part of a global pandemic, in the best way possible. I wish more than anything else I could snap my fingers and make it go away. I can't. This is a global pandemic. We need to deal with it properly and systematically, with all of us playing our part. Students, and this is really tough for students, and you know, we all understand the welfare issues of this. I said a moment ago, I have a 17-year-old nephew in his first year at university living in halls of residence right now, like families across the country. I worry about him. So we all understand the emotional impact of this as well as the practical impact. That's why I have a duty, universities have a duty, to say to young people, make sure you're not putting yourself at risk through parties in student accommodation or socialising in a way that increases that risk. It's why universities have a duty to make sure that the welfare of isolating students is properly catered for and all of the other guidance is implemented, and why we do have a system in place that means that when a student is symptomatic, they get quick access to testing. If they are positive, Test and Protect then steps in to make sure that their close contacts are given the right advice. None of this is easy for anybody right now, but the responsibility of government is to make sure we take these issues head on, support those out there on the front line, and get through this collectively as a country, which I believe we will.
Thank you. Question number 3, Patrick Harvey.
I don't pretend that any of this is easy, but it is also the responsibility of Parliament to raise these issues in a constructive manner. With outbreaks in Edinburgh, St Andrews, Dundee, Aberdeen and Glasgow, and over 1,000 students in halls in self-isolation, we need to remember this is the situation just weeks into term. Now, many of these students will be first-year students away from home for the first time, excited about their new life at university. And it is heartbreaking that they're now cooped up and coping with this new anxiety. They need their universities and the government to make sure that they get the support that they need. But the truth is that outbreaks like this should have been expected, and support and testing sites should have been in place before term started. A bit like the cruise ships at the start of this pandemic, opening student halls has brought people from far and wide together into densely populated accommodation, providing the perfect conditions for the spread of the virus. And student halls have a far greater potential for outbreaks to spread into the wider community. The real number of infections may already be far higher than we know. The First Minister hasn't yet told us, so will she now, exactly what proportion of Scotland's new cases are accounted for by outbreaks in student accommodations? When will the walk-in centres that she talks about be available, not just for bookings, but actually fully operational and conducting the tests that are needed? And what specific action will the government take to prevent student outbreaks from spreading into the wider community?
First Minister.
They open for booking one day and they do the test the following day. That's how it works. Can I say first of all, I absolutely accept. Obviously, it's not voluntary. The importance and the right of Parliament to ask questions. I'm simply making the point that I think we all have a responsibility to discuss these issues in a way that helps not to increase the anxiety of students, but helps to give the information and the advice to students in a proper and sensible way, and that's what we are seeking to do. The other thing I think is really important, and testing is vital here, but it is absolutely wrong to say that it is somehow an absence or a shortage of testing availability that is an issue in terms of outbreaks in student accommodation. Students who need testing are being tested. That's why we see the numbers of cases within the student population continue to increase. If we weren't testing them, we wouldn't know that these cases existed and their contacts wouldn't be being told to isolate, and we would then have situations on our hands that we weren't able to try to manage and control in the way that we are doing right now. Patrick Harvey is absolutely right about the importance of welfare, and universities have been preparing and planning and are making sure that the welfare of students is catered for, and I think that is a big responsibility that they need to make sure that they take seriously. And we have to make sure that students have the advice that they need to minimise the risk of spreading the virus elsewhere. That is why it is really difficult for students, but not mixing outside their household groups, not socialising in the normal way students would, not having house parties. These things are really important. In terms of the numbers, because Patrick Harvey asked me a question, in Glasgow there is a significant proportion of the cases we report today will come from the outbreak at Glasgow University. Obviously, Test and Protect is still working through these cases, and of course we will make breakdowns of the figures available as and when it is possible to do that. But students, just as we had a difficult period when schools went back with increased anxiety, we need to make sure that the systems in universities that need to be there are there and working. But this is going to be, as long as this virus is here and we don't have a vaccine against it, we are going to have to be managing this situation, and we will do that to the best of our ability. We will learn the lessons as we go, and where things are not working, we will take steps to make sure that they do in future.
Patrick Harvey.
I certainly don't say that students aren't being tested. I am saying that where we have the potential for rapid new outbreaks, we need far more testing capacity than was available at the start of term, and it should have been there. We all want Test and Protect to continue working. We all want that, but it is going to need more capacity in these areas. Student populations also go, of course, well beyond student halls. Many of them rely on the private rented sector, and that, of course, is about the impact on our wider community. So I want to move on to issues in relation to the private rented sector. In August, the First Minister told me that no people can be evicted because of what she described as an effective eviction ban in response to the Scottish Green calls for greater support for tenants during the pandemic. Yesterday, the private rented sector housing tribunal issued the 100th eviction order since it restarted in July. That's not much of a ban. People shouldn't be getting evicted in the middle of a global pandemic, and it would be unacceptable if this situation carried on into the winter. Why are people being evicted when the First Minister said they wouldn't be? And will the First Minister now commit to an actual ban on winter evictions?
First Minister.
Patrick Harvey and Andy Whiteman and I discussed this in my office just a few weeks ago, so I think Patrick Harvey, because he was able to articulate it to me back then, understands and knows the answer to the question he's just asked me. We have put in place a system to make sure that for people who are getting into difficulties with rent arrears because of the pandemic, then the protections, the timescale of those protections that are in place constitute an effective ban on eviction over this winter period. What we discussed then, and I know he understood, is that system can't be made retrospective to deal with cases that were in the system before the pandemic, and I suspect what Patrick Harvey is talking about are the cases that are coming through that predate that, but I'm happy to look at the detail if I'm misunderstanding the issue he's raising. We have also put in place, though, again at the request of the Scottish Green Party, the fund to help people who are in difficulties with their rent in order to recognise and try to deal with the financial pressures that people are dealing with. So we will continue to take reasonable, practical steps to give people the protection against eviction or other hardship through the pandemic when the hardship they're experiencing, as we know, is no fault of theirs.
Question number 4, Willie Rennie.
Unfortunately, the window of opportunity has passed to test international students on arrival. I think we had a duty of care for them, and I regret the decision not to. But following the recent outbreaks on campuses across the country, we do need to do more to track down the virus. I feel for students away from home for the first time, forced to self-isolate in halls of residence. I think of their families many miles away, worried for the safety of their children. They both deserve reassurance that the health services in Scotland are focused on keeping them safe. As a significant proportion of the virus, of people with the virus, don't know that they have it, the risk of unknowingly spreading the disease is there. So if they don't know they have it, we need to help them find it. Students need to stick by the advice, that's right, but we also need to do so much more too. So will the First Minister rethink the approach to routine asymptomatic testing for students?
First Minister.
Can I firstly say to Willie Rennie, I do feel for students right now, and I feel for their families. As I've said a couple of times, I'm the member of a family that worries about a student in that very position. So I know, not just theoretically, I know in reality how that feels right now. Also, I don't want to labour this point because we've had exchanges on it before, and I accept the point, and it's a legitimate point, but international students, they have the obligation to quarantine. And the reason for that, as opposed to testing, is that while no system is absolutely perfect, it is felt that quarantine is a more effective system, because if you test somebody who comes in who tests negative, it doesn't mean they don't have the virus. It may just mean they're in the incubation period. So quarantine for 14 days is a more effective way of trying to protect against importation. And that takes me into the other point. So Willie Rennie says, will we rethink? We are always thinking about our approach to testing and taking the best clinical advice on it. I think there is an increased role for, and we are doing increased surveillance testing. One of the issues right now, and Willie Rennie is right in terms of identifying the problem. The question is, what's the best solution? So a student who doesn't know they have the virus because they're not displaying symptoms, and this is not just true of students, of any of us, the problem is you could be tested and you still won't know you have the virus because the test will be negative, because you are perhaps in the incubation period or you're genuinely asymptomatic and the test won't show up the virus. And therefore, I'm not saying we should never do that. The problem is we've got to be careful that that negative test then doesn't lead a student to say, I'm fine, I don't need to bother with isolation, I don't need to bother abiding by social distancing and all of the rules. So these are careful judgments that, frankly, I have to take advice on, because I'm not a clinician, I'm not a public health expert, and we do think about these things on an ongoing basis and will continue to do so. The most important thing right now, and every bit of clinical advice that I've got will tell you this, the most important thing we need to do is get symptomatic students tested, and we are doing that, and then where they are positive, giving the right advice about isolation to their contacts. And that is what is happening right now. And that is why the numbers we're looking at right now are as high, because that system is working the way it's intended to. Of course, what we also need to do is work with students and others to get more prevention and stop the virus spreading in the first place.
Willie Rennie.
I mean, I accept the First Minister's argument. My concern is that people relax when they don't think they have the virus, and they don't go the extra mile to stick by the rules, despite all of our pleas for them to do so. So I think an extra measure of extra routine testing would give us the absolute assurance that people who have got it are definitely isolating and keeping out of the way. That would be the extra step that I think would be an extra safety measure that would protect us all. Now, yesterday we were told that some of the local outbreaks across the country here were because of travellers returning from Greece. So the quarantine spot check system is an important defence against the virus. It has seen repeated problems over numerous weeks. At the start, the Justice Secretary said the spot checks were working well when they hadn't even started. He changed the target, changed it again, and the system is still missing over 1,100 people. In the new target, 20%, not limited by 450 as was previous, of those arrivals required to quarantine would receive a spot check, but it's still only 9%, half of what the target is supposed to be. So when is the government going to get on top of the quarantine spot checks?
First Minister.
Additional resources are being applied to this. I think by the 5th of October, the resources will be doing the full 20%, even though already it's doing more than the 450 target. Let me remind Willie Rennie that 100% of everybody coming into the country from quarantine places are emailed, so there is contact with 100%. And the other thing, and I accept before I say this, that this is partly a reflection of the summer holiday season ending, but the numbers coming through our Test and Protect data of positive cases that identify foreign travel as one of the things that they tell the contact tracers is reducing. So that's positive as well. And of course, it was because we saw that information about Greece coming through the system that we applied quarantine to Greece. So, you know, the system actually is giving us the information to direct some of the efforts that we make. Look, these are all perfectly legitimate issues, and even if I'm not saying all of the things that people want me to be saying right now, please be assured that these are the things we are thinking through and considering and reconsidering every single day. And Willie Rennie's initial point in his second question is actually a valid one. But in a sense, mine is the other side of that. If it is the case, and I think he's right, that people, perhaps particularly young people who don't have symptoms, relax and don't think they're at risk, there is a genuine question about whether giving somebody a test that is negative, even although they may have the virus, makes them more or less relaxed. I just think that is an open question, and it is part of the consideration that we have to go through in terms of the tactical use of testing. The fundamentally important use of testing right now is to get those who have symptoms, if they're positive, isolate their contacts, and that is what Test and Protect is focusing on. And while I am the last person to demonstrate any complacency about any of this, Test and Protect is working well right now, and that is a great credit to everybody in that system who is working so hard.
Thank you. Question number 5, Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to the report of the independent review into policing during the miners' strike. First Minister.
The miners' strike of 1984-85, of course, divided people in many ways, with miners and indeed police officers often finding themselves in challenging situation. And I know the very strong feelings about the strike, particularly on the part of miners and their families, remain to this day. So I understand that many of those affected are eager to see the report and the Scottish Government's response, and I can confirm that the Justice Secretary plans to report the Scottish Government's response to Parliament by the middle of October, and the independent report will be published at the same time.
Annabel Ewing.
I thank the First Minister for her answer, and I would take this opportunity to commend all those who have campaigned for so long to secure justice for these miners. I understand that the report will in fact recommend pardons for those men who were only trying to defend their jobs, their families and their communities. I hear what the First Minister says, but I'm sure that my constituents in Cowdenbeath and in former mining communities across Scotland would be keen to have an indication of the intention in terms of a matter of principle that the Scottish Government will act to right those wrongs.
First Minister.
Can I thank Annabel Ewing for a question, and can I agree with the sentiments of it? I think many of us who had our kind of formative teenage years around the time of the miners' strike will always remember the impact of that and the very strong feelings and the kind of community I grew up in. I absolutely understand that. I hope Annabel Ewing will understand that it would not be appropriate for me to preempt today the publication of the report and the publication of the Government's response by the Justice Secretary, which, as I say, will happen within the next couple of weeks. And I think it would be better for everybody concerned to allow those to be read and understood properly. What I would say is that I very much hope that miners and the families of miners will welcome both the recommendation in the report and the response of the Government, and I hope they will feel at that point that there has been a recognition of what many do consider to be the injustice that was suffered.
Thank you. Question number 6, Rachel Hamilton, and Rachel Hamilton joins us remotely.
To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to reduce waiting lists for social housing.
First Minister.
Ensuring that everyone has access to a safe, warm and affordable place to call home is absolutely essential to my sense of a fair Scotland, which is why we have invested and continue to invest in expanding our social housing stock. Since 2007, we've delivered more than 66,000 new homes for social rent as part of over 95,000 affordable homes. We've invested more than £3.5 billion to deliver on our target of 50,000 affordable homes, including 35,000 for social rent over this parliamentary term alone. We've committed £300 million interim funding for the affordable housing supply budget for the next financial year, which will ensure that new social housing continues to be delivered beyond this current parliamentary term. In addition, to ensure homes remain in the social rented sector, of course, we ended the right to buy, protecting up to 15,500 houses being sold over a 10-year period.
Rachel Hamilton.
Thank the First Minister for that answer. Presiding Officer, Shelter's analysis shows that 70,000 children are currently on social housing waiting lists. At the end of March, there were over 7,000 children living in temporary accommodation due to homelessness. The Scottish Conservatives support building affordable homes, which is a key aspect to driving down child poverty, creating jobs and meeting climate change targets. But, First Minister, even without the coronavirus crisis, your 50,000 affordable homes target was going to be missed over the course of this Parliament. Therefore, my question is, how will this SNP government expedite the delivery of social housing in line with Shelter's campaign?
First Minister.
Firstly, the 50,000 target was actually absolutely on track to be delivered, and we will do everything we can, notwithstanding COVID, to make sure that is met as quickly as possible. And as I said, we've already committed funding into the next financial year so that we can continue that commitment beyond this parliamentary term. I'll take at face value, absolutely take at face value and in good faith, the members' commitment to social housing and to seeing the provision of social housing and seeing children not have to be on waiting lists for social housing. Can I politely suggest to her, though, that perhaps a valuable thing she could do, if that is genuine, as I'm sure it is to say to her Conservative colleagues in government in London to make sure that the budget for the Scottish Government is protected so that we don't see cuts applied there, and to perhaps stop undermining and cutting the benefit entitlement of children in poverty across this country, which doesn't do anything to help the provision of housing. So perhaps if the Conservatives occasionally match the rhetoric with the action around poverty and homelessness and social housing, we might all be in a better position.
Question number 7, Jackie Bailey.
To ask the First Minister for what reason the Scottish Government will not meet its target of helping 38,000 people back into employment through the Fair Start Scotland programme.
First Minister.
Fair Start Scotland provides intensive support for our most vulnerable unemployed people. Participants are treated with dignity and respect, and of course, unlike some UK Government approaches, participation is voluntary. We continue to work towards the target of supporting 38,000 people. COVID has presented challenges to engaging new participants and delivering services, and referrals and starts have both dropped since lockdown started. Most of the referrals come from the DWP, but of course these were suspended during lockdown to respond to increased demand for benefit claims, and also lockdown restrictions on face-to-face interactions meant that fewer people were able to engage with services. Fair Start Scotland, though, has supported more than 24,300 people since 2018, and pre-COVID referral to start rates were increasing. So we remain absolutely committed to this service. We've extended delivery to March 2023 so that we can continue to work with partners to support the vulnerable.
Jackie Bailey.
Can I thank the First Minister for that response? Whilst I acknowledge the announcement of the Chancellor of a job subsidy scheme, I fear there will still be a significant number of job losses before the end of the year. And I appreciate that the pandemic has disrupted the delivery of the programme, but given the likely scale of unemployment, missing the target by some 14,000 people is indeed very disappointing. Will the First Minister give a commitment that any money saved as a result of missing the target is spent on employment support programmes to help a generation of young people who may find themselves out of work?
First Minister.
I think we've already given the commitment to significant investment in support for young people who may be facing unemployment, and absolutely the commitment that I've talked about around Fair Start Scotland is unchanged, and that will include the financial commitment to it. It is disappointing for all of us, but when you have referrals being suspended and when you have the suspension of face-to-face interaction, it is unfortunately unavoidable. The challenge now is to get that back on track. I haven't had the chance, obviously, because I was on my way to the Chamber, to see all of the detail of the Chancellor's announcements on the intended replacement for the furlough scheme. I hope it will be positive. The snippets I heard just before I came down suggest that it is a step forward, but perhaps not far enough to prevent the increase in what I would describe as avoidable redundancies and unemployment if there is proper support put in place. But I look forward to being able to look at more of the detail of that later on.
Thank you very much. We're going to move to open supplementaries. Christine Graham to be followed by Miles Briggs. Christine Graham.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister if she considers that management, particularly in retail and hospitality, should encourage staff to have their mobile phones on them to enable the contact tracing app to be more effective, given their considerable contact with the public when out and about, as it were, on the shop floor.
First Minister.
Yes, I would strongly agree with that. I would stress that for individuals, downloading and using the app is voluntary. I strongly encourage people to do it. We're almost at 1.2 million people in Scotland downloaded it. It's really good to see the England and Wales app launched today. These are really important ways of trying to extend the reach of our test and protect systems. But I would ask all employers to actively promote the app and, crucially, to go to Christine Graham's point, enable staff to carry their phones with them, particularly in those environments like supermarkets, perhaps, where staff have lots of contact with customers and clients. So that is really important. Just a point of information, we've created a dedicated stakeholder page on the protect.scot website to help employers raise awareness of the app, and I would encourage all employers to make use of that.
Miles Briggs to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yesterday, family-run businesses and their employees from across Scotland's soft play centres protested outside Parliament. Without action and support, they warn that over 4,500 jobs are likely to be lost. Now, play centres safely reopened in Wales on the 10th of August, in England on the 15th of August, and in Northern Ireland on the 14th of September. They have demonstrated that they can provide COVID-safe play for children under the age of 12 and support young families during this difficult period. As we head into the winter months, parents and guardians across Scotland want access to safe play spaces for their children. So can I ask the First Minister if she'd be willing to meet with representatives to look into the plight of the sector in Scotland and whether or not SNP ministers will now provide clarity and support for this key part of our play centre space in Scotland?
First Minister.
The government engages with different sectors all of the time. Of course, ministers would be happy to meet with any sector, including the soft play centre. I absolutely understand how difficult it is for any sector, including it, that isn't able to trade fully, or indeed in some cases trade at all right now. We continue to be very focused on trying to reopen those aspects of the economy and society that are not yet open, but that has to be done safely. And when we have a rising prevalence of the virus again, as we do just now, clearly those decisions are even more, or have to be taken even more carefully than has been the case in recent weeks. We will also continue to do what we can to provide financial and economic support for sectors that are not trading normally. An issue I voiced yesterday, and I stress again, I am not seeking to do this for political reasons, but it is a statement of fact. I increasingly worry, because of the financial constraints over how the Scottish Government budget is made available, the mismatch between what we need to do in a public health capacity and our ability to mitigate the impact of that financially and economically. And that's the reason one of the reasons I wrote to the Prime Minister raising this issue last night. But of course we will continue to engage as positively as we can with affected sectors, because I fully understand the implications for them and for the jobs that rely on them of the situation that we are dealing with.
Stuart McMillan to be followed by Claire Baker.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I'm fully aware that the regular dialogue has been taking place between the Scottish Government and the footballing authorities. But can the First Minister consider the introduction of a football task force to try and find a way to help football navigate a way throughout this pandemic, which safeguards the future of our clubs, particularly the smaller community clubs, which play such an important part in the social and economic fabric of their communities?
First Minister.
Well, I absolutely recognise the important role football in particular, but sport in general, plays in communities, and the part it plays in the well-being of our life overall. We are working very closely right now with the football authorities and other partners, including football clubs. Officials are represented on the Football Joint Response Group that was established to respond to the issues that the pandemic presented for football at all levels, and we are happy to consider how best we can continue working together to safeguard the future of all clubs in the SPFL and below across the country. The Sport Minister wrote to the UK Government yesterday as well, seeking some engagement about how collectively we look at a financial recovery package for sport, because while their on-field activities often dominate, clubs at all levels make a really big contribution to individuals and communities, and we've got to recognise it in that wider sphere. So we will continue to work closely with football to try to hopefully get the game back to normal, with the rest of our society back to normal as quickly as possible, but to provide as much support as we can in the interim.
Claire Baker, to be followed by Sandra White.
Presiding Officer, on Tuesday we saw a trading of blame between the UK. We saw a trading of blame between the UK and the Scottish Government over the awarding of the Seagreen offshore wind farm project to China, when the Scottish supply chains, including BIFAB, got nothing. A member's update from GMB this week not only says that both governments are to blame for the current process, which keeps producing the same results, but that the Scottish Government asked SSE to keep the unions in the dark about the announcement, and they had to find out from the press coverage. These jobs are too important for Fife, and the trade unions must not be isolated during this process. Does the First Minister recognise this situation is unacceptable, and will she ensure it doesn't happen again?
First Minister.
Well, can I say firstly that I think this government has demonstrated, I hope I've demonstrated the commitment we have to BIFAB and to the involvement of trade unions. I have personally, on a whole number of occasions around BIFAB, engaged directly with the trade unions, and we will continue to do that. So we have a very strong commitment. We have a financial investment in BIFAB, which I think demonstrates that commitment. That said, the circumstances for BIFAB and the conditions in which it is operating are not easy, and there is a challenging period ahead of us. There's no attempt to play a blame game here. Sometimes it is really important, though, for public understanding as well as political understanding, to make sure we are clear where some of the issues lie. It is a statement of fact that the current UK government contract for difference scheme is one of the factors that puts acute pressure on the management of project costs, and that is just inescapable, and we need the constructive cooperation of the UK government to try to work through some of the issues that are a barrier right now to the development of a sustainable supply chain in the renewable sector. And I hope we can all agree on that and seek to address that constructively. In the meantime, we will continue to engage with BIFAB and the trade unions there to try, as has always been our objective, to find a sustainable future for BIFAB. It is not easy, and I am not suggesting it is, but the commitment of the government remains absolutely to that.
Sandra White, to be followed by Maurice Corrie.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. First Minister, this afternoon we will debate Stage 1 Protection of Workers Bill. As a former Usdaw shop steward, it's a bill which I fully support. However, whilst we debate this, my constituent, Richie Venton, faces uncertain future, having been sacked by IKEA in Glasgow, a firm which has made £11.2 billion in profit. Just for carrying out his trade union duties to protect workers' paying conditions during COVID-19. He has been sacked. Can I ask the First Minister what protection this government can give to union reps in carrying out their union duties?
First Minister.
Can I thank Sandra White for raising the issue? I should say I know Richie Venton. I've known him for many years. I've probably campaigned both against and with him in various different points over the years. But notwithstanding that, I think it's really important that I don't get drawn into commenting on individual cases without all of the information. But I will be clear about this, that the law offers protection to enable people to carry out their trade union duties without fear of recrimination, and that is a really important principle that all employers should not just understand, but make sure they practice in workplaces. So I would urge IKEA to get round the table with the union and reach a positive resolution to this matter. We are committed to enhancing workers' statutory rights and protections through our Fair Work policy, and we continue to engage with the STUC and individual unions about that. But the ability of trade union officials to carry out their trade union duties is an important principle that all of us should endorse without equivocation.
Maurice Corrie, to be followed by James Dornan.
Presiding officer, earlier this week I was informed by a local pharmacy in my West Scotland region that it is having great difficulty in getting supplies of the flu vaccine to meet their patients' demands for vaccinations, as they are being told their supplier has no stock of the vaccine. What action has the First Minister put in place to ensure that we have sufficient stocks of the flu vaccine to meet demand for vaccinations throughout Scotland before winter is upon us?
First Minister.
We have a very well-developed plan, not just to procure the stocks of flu vaccine that are made available through the NHS for NHS-eligible groups. Obviously, pharmacies will often have additional stocks for other people, but our focus is on the eligible groups, which have been extended this year, and the flu vaccine programme has been delivered slightly differently because of COVID, and we procure the supplies through a UK-wide system. Perhaps the best thing to ask the member to do on the pharmacy in his region is to write to the Health Secretary so we can look into the particular issues there and see if there's action we can take to assist with that.
James Dornan, who joins us remotely, to be followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the First Minister if she shares my concerns that the UK Government's proposed internal market bill will limit Scotland's ability to legislate in the area of building regulations to maintain the highest standards which protect Scottish householders from catastrophic events like the Grenfell disaster?
First Minister.
Yes, I do very strongly share that concern. It's one of the very many concerns I have about the UK Government's internal market bill, and that it will undermine this Parliament's ability to legislate for and insist on the highest standards across a whole range of different areas. We have the General Teaching Council today articulating a concern about the potential for standards for the teaching profession to be undermined. But on the specific issue that James Dornan raises, we've had different building regulatory requirements for decades. That's never resulted in barriers for business, but the UK internal market white paper that preceded the bill cited different building regulations as an example of an additional cost to business in the UK. There is not a shred of credible evidence, or any evidence in my view, to support that view. For decades we've benefited from setting our own robust building safety standards. So it's another reason why this bill is wrong for Scotland, and why I think all of us across the party spectrum in this Parliament should resist vigorously any attempt by the UK Government to limit the ability of this Parliament to protect the people of Scotland.
Sarah Boyack, to be followed by Joe McAlpine. Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the First Minister whether she will intervene to help Capital Theatres, Edinburgh's theatre charity, weather the storm they are facing due to loss of income? First Minister, without emergency funding, jobs are at risk and the much-loved King's Theatre faces closure if the charity can't fill the £8 million gap on their vital refurbishment plans.
First Minister.
So we have made funding available to help to help the culture sector, including cultural venues. I know the Culture Secretary is engaged specifically in the issue of Capital Theatres and the King's Theatre in Edinburgh. I've had representations from a number of people, including recently Brian Cox, on that issue. So I will ask the Culture Secretary very soon and very urgently to write to the member to update on those discussions and the assistance that hopefully we will be able to provide.
Joan McAlpine, who joins us remotely, to be followed by Graham Simpson.
Thank you very much. The Scottish Government has been asked today to consider routine testing of students, and I share concern about student outbreaks. However, the First Minister knows that I have repeatedly raised the need to routinely test care workers supporting vulnerable disabled people, including learning disabled people, outside care home settings, and I was encouraged that the Cabinet Secretary for Health recently told me this group was being considered as testing capacity expanded, as indeed are close family carers, to allow visiting. Now, I don't want to downplay the student outbreak in any way, but can I appeal to the First Minister and indeed to others in this chamber that routine testing to protect disabled people should come before the routine testing of young and healthy people if a choice has to be made due to capacity?
First Minister.
What we want to try and do is make sure that our testing decisions are driven by clinical considerations and the considerations about how we best protect vulnerable populations. Of course, I'm not for a minute saying that we don't have to think very carefully about capacity issues, but we want our decisions to be driven for the right reasons. And I can assure the member that the group she identifies is very much in our thinking as part of our winter planning for possible extension of routine testing. As I've been saying to others in relation to students, there are some complex issues we have to consider when it comes to routine testing and the place that has. But where there are clear vulnerabilities with disabled people, with care homes, then there are often reasons there that lead you toward routine testing that may not exist when we're dealing with other parts of the population.
Graham Simpson, to be followed by Colin Beattie. Graham Simpson.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. During the pandemic, both our governments have been bringing in laws which impact on civil liberties, and I have to say, for the best of reasons, but all done without prior parliamentary scrutiny. An example this week, of course, is the ban on people visiting other households. I'm of the view that wherever possible, Parliament should be able to scrutinise laws before they come in. And I would just appeal to the First Minister if she would agree to review the way emergency legislation is done in this place so that Parliament can have prior scrutiny of laws.
First Minister.
Look, I hope the member will take this answer constructively, because I, in general terms, agree with that. Of course, you want Parliament to scrutinise law before it comes into force, not after it has come into force. And we obviously have statutory requirements to review the emergency legislation, the regulations that are made under it regularly, and the overall acts on a certain basis. So Parliament is involved in that. What I would say, and I hope everybody will understand this, in the situation we're in right now, it is on a whole range of different ways just not possible to do things in the ideal way that all of us would want. Unfortunately, this virus doesn't agree to take a few days off while Parliament scrutinises important measures that are needed to protect people from the spread of it. And I know everybody understands that. So it's just another one of the many multitude of ways in which we're having to try and strike the best balances we can, given the nature of what we're dealing with, and recognising that they are not ideal balances, and that so much of what we're doing right now we wouldn't choose to do in those ways if we had a choice or more of a choice over it. So I hope members recognise that. I think they do, but we will try to facilitate as much parliamentary scrutiny as early as possible in all of these things as is feasible.
Colin Beattie, to be followed by Neil Findlay.
The latest monthly GDP statistics for Scotland show that the economy expanded by 6.8% in July. Given the different pace of the easing of lockdown measures in different parts of the UK, can I ask the First Minister how Scotland's economic performance compares to the UK since lockdown measures were introduced in March?
First Minister.
Well, both Scotland and the UK as a whole saw record falls in the economy following the introduction of restrictions, and I think everybody understands why that is the case. We effectively closed down much of the economy, but some of this fall has been made up as the economy has reopened. GDP in Scotland remains 10.7% lower than it was in February. The corresponding UK figure is 11.7% lower. So there's a broad comparability there between Scotland and the UK as a whole. But all of these figures highlight that the pandemic continues to have not just a serious health impact, but a very serious economic impact. And we are working hard to rebuild the economy through the safe reopening of it, and then using the experience of the pandemic to build a more resilient and sustainable economy. And we'll continue to do that, working where appropriate with colleagues in the governments across the UK.
Neil Findlay, to be followed by Emma Harper.
As a supplementary to Annabel Ewan's question, can I offer my sincere thanks to the Government for undertaking the independent review of policing of the miners' strike in Scotland. And I have to give particular credit to the then Justice Secretary Michael Matheson for commissioning it. Unlike his predecessor, he listened to us, he took us seriously, and I want to thank him personally and publicly for that. The review panel appear to have taken on board the proposal for a scheme of pardon that I put to them, but I understand this will require legislation. Given that many former miners have passed on and those who remain grow older, will the First Minister commit to ensuring any legislation to enact the scheme comes before Parliament before dissolution in March?
First Minister.
We will look very closely at the timescale for doing that. I don't want. There's two things I don't want to do today. I mean, people across the chamber will note that I am not pushing back against any of the speculation that has been in the media recently, and they can draw their own conclusions from that. But it's important I don't preempt the publication of the report or the government's response. I think for a whole range of reasons, not anything to do with what our instincts were pushing us towards, but a whole host of practical and legal issues. We've had to take some time to consider this properly, and that is important. So we'll publish the report and the response in the middle of October. Can I just also say I think Michael Matheson does deserve a huge amount of credit for taking this issue as seriously as he did and getting us to the position we are in right now. Obviously, any implications of that we will also set out to Parliament at that point. But suffice to say, I fully understand that for many minors and their families, they're not getting any younger, and if there is to be a degree of recognition of what was suffered back then the sooner that happens, the better.
Emma Harper, to be followed by Beatrice Wishart.
To ask the First Minister what support will be or is being provided to NHS Dumfries and Galloway, given the board has suspended inpatient visits at the Galloway Community Hospital in order to protect vulnerable patients from potential COVID-19 infection.
First Minister.
The Health Secretary, of course, will be happy to look into the specific circumstances there why visiting has been suspended. Obviously, we work with and support health boards in the whole range of things that they are doing right now to try to reduce the spread of coronavirus, deal with outbreaks and, of course, deal with COVID patients and non-COVID patients. And the issues around visiting have to be very carefully handled. We want to get visiting to hospitals and indeed to care homes back to as much normality as possible, as quickly as possible. But where there are spikes or clusters, sometimes decisions have to be taken with the protection of vulnerable patients uppermost in mind. But I'll ask the Health Secretary to liaise with the member about the specific local circumstances.
Beatrice Wishart, who joins us remotely, to be followed by John Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last week, Prospect Union published a report that showed that High Isle's remote tower plan will take at least £18 million of economic benefit from island communities and from island economies, and that costs of the scheme have increased significantly. This confirms what High Isle's own consultants have said, namely that centralising air traffic services in Inverness is the most costly and risky option, and High Isle has been hell-bent on pursuing it. Given the massive downturn in the aviation sector, the high and spiralling costs of centralisation, and the opposition from staff and local communities, will the First Minister now instruct High Isle to call a halt to this damaging project?
First Minister.
I'll ask the Transport Secretary to write to the member with more detail. There is a need to modernise air traffic control to ensure both more sustainable and reliable services in the Highlands and Islands. High Isle has been tasked with taking this process forward to find the safest and most sustainable solution. They've taken their decisions based on the best available information and analysis of the different options available. Obviously, this is a big change technically and personally for staff, and the High Isle need to continue to involve their staff and key stakeholders as this process continues. But we will, of course, and High Isle will, of course, continue to listen to views and opinions that are expressed, and I'll ask the Transport Secretary to correspond with the member with more detail of the current situation.
John Scott, to be followed by Alec Rowley.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will know I raised questions with the Cabinet Secretary yesterday about increasing access for key family members to elderly and fragile relatives in care homes, particularly in Ayrshire. Her answer implied that she is very aware of this problem and seeking to deal with this lack of access. If testing capacity is now available, would the Scottish Government now consider routine testing for key family members to reassure nursing home managers, as Joan McAlpine has suggested, that it is safe to admit key family members into their nursing homes as winter approaches and outdoor meetings become impractical?
First Minister.
So, in short, yes, we are considering possible steps like that. The Health Secretary, as I indicated she would be at FMQs last week, met last Friday, I think, representatives from the Care Home Relatives group and discussed a range of proposals put forward by the group. We have a clinical and professional advisory group advising us around these issues. They're currently looking at what more we can do to strike a much better balance between family and visitor contact and activities and healthcare services for residents, while continuing to protect them as best we can from the introduction of the virus into their homes. These are important balances to get as right as possible, so they have to be considered carefully, but the particular proposal around testing that John Scott raises is one that is under consideration.
And Alec Rowley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Over the last 2 weeks, NHS 5 issued thousands of letters to older people telling them they had a phone number that they had to phone and book to get a flu vaccine. When people phoned the number, they got a message saying try later. NHS 5 have since apologised and say they will have it fixed within the next few weeks. But yesterday I was contacted by a lady from Kelty who is disabled with underlying health conditions, and when she eventually got through, she was offered a vaccine in Lochgelly, which is 2 buses away, Dunfermline, a bus ride and a long walk, or Glenrothes, and I won't even go there. Aside from the risk that people are being asked to put themselves in to get the vaccine, do you agree there is a greater risk that people will just stop trying and give up? I don't underestimate the enormity of the challenges facing the government, but the First Minister, this is not good enough, and will you do something about it?
First Minister.
I think I'll resist the temptation to join Alec Rowley in the sort of Fife geographic politics that he was engaging in there. Not least because I've got family in Fife and it would get me into trouble. But these are important issues. Obviously, the flu vaccination programme is by necessity being delivered differently this year because of the COVID risks. We aim for everyone eligible for a flu vaccination to receive an appointment after the programme commences on the 1st of October. And it's really important that everybody eligible takes up that opportunity. The issues around the phone line with Fife were addressed, and other issues around access. The Health Secretary will work with health boards to make sure that people who are eligible have the access in the way that they need to have it to make sure that they take up that opportunity. So I'll ask the Health Secretary to correspond directly with Alec Rowley about the concerns he raises and specifically how they are being addressed.
Thank you very much. And that concludes First Minister's questions. We're going to suspend and resume at 2:30 with portfolio questions on communities and local government. Parliament is suspended.